was a little after midnight, and Flawless, an aspiring rapper from Palmdale, California, was feeling creatively inspired. He had been writing songs all day long, and he really wanted to get into a recording studio. The only trouble was, his car was in the shop. His cell phone was also disconnected, so he was stuck. And so early that morning, he left his apartment and walked to a corner store where there was a payphone. When he got there, he called a friend, a producer friend, who was supposed to come and pick him up and drive him to the studio. That's when he saw them. Two young men wearing hooded sweatshirts, walking toward him from across the boulevard. Now, at first, he didn't think twice about them. But as they got closer, he realized that one of them was carrying a big plastic cup. When they got a little closer, he noticed that the guy carrying the cup also appeared to be holding a gun inside the cup. This is when he started to panic. When they got within earshot, one of them asked him, "Where are you from?" Flawless knew the drill. He had grown up his entire life around street gangs and knew that they were trying to figure out if he was gang affiliated. In fact, he had spent much of his young adult life trying to distance himself from that world. Hip-hop was a way out. Hip-hop represented a creative alternative to the gang life. And so he quickly replied, "I ain't from nowhere. I don't bang." The gunman then drew his pistol and opened fire at Flawless, who ran in the opposite direction. Bullets whizzed by him, ricocheting off of buildings, cars, telephone poles. Two of the bullets hit Flawless in the lower part of his back, almost knocking him to the ground. Flawless then dove for cover in between two parked cars on the side of the road and lay there, waiting to die. Now, I met Flawless many years before this tragic morning. Back then, I was a graduate student at UCLA, and I was doing research that would lead to my first book, a long-term study of young black men from South Central Los Angeles who were trying to blow up or make it in the music industry as rappers. Flawless was one of the first aspiring rappers that I met at a legendary hip-hop open mic workshop called Project Blowed. And in truth, he was hard to miss. He had that swagger, that charisma. He was the kind of guy that everybody would circle around whenever he would spit a freestyle. And whenever I would talk to his friends, they would always say that Flawless had as good of a shot as anyone at blowing up and realizing his rap dreams. And for a while, it looked like he might just blow up. He was performing in new venues, he was gaining new fans, he was talking to record labels. Everything seemed to be falling into place. And then he got shot. And getting shot changed everything. Flawless's shooting would inspire me to learn more about the gun violence epidemic in the U.S. And so I started looking at the data. And I found three important patterns that help outline the scope of the problem. Number one, young black men are the most at-risk group for getting shot and killed in the U.S. Homicide, of which about 2/3 are committed with firearms, is the leading cause of death for young black men ages 15 to 29. It is not a leading cause of death for young men in any other racial or ethnic group. Now, some of these disparities become more visible when we compare victimization rates across different groups. In 2014, white men between the ages of 15 and 29 were fatally shot at a rate of about 5 per 100,000. Black men in the same age group were shot and killed at a rate of 63 per 100,000. This means that black men were about 12 times more likely to be fatally shot in the U.S. than white men. So there's a huge racial and ethnic gap when it comes to gun violence victimization. Number 2, most people who get shot don't die. In fact, the Centers for Disease Control estimate that 4 out of 5 shootings in the U.S. are non-fatal. This means that 80% of the people who get shot in drive-by shootings, armed robberies, and other kinds of street violence live to see another day. But they survive with a number of different injuries that transform their mental and physical health. Flawless would end up surviving. After about a minute or so of laying on the concrete, he picked himself up and realized that the gunman had run off. He then ran home and got his roommate to drive him to the hospital, where he was treated for gunshot wounds to the abdomen. Flawless would spend the next 3 weeks in the hospital recovering, and then he was released, wearing a colostomy bag, which he still wears today. Flawless also emerged from the hospital with post-traumatic stress. He had nightmares. He was fearful. He was depressed. He also suffered from kidney problems and other kinds of health complications after the fact. Getting shot wasn't a death sentence, but it was the beginning of a painful and very precarious existence. Number 3, most gunshot victims don't have access to long-term care, long-term health care. And this is a huge problem. Those of us who work in health disparities know that long-term access to health care is a basic safety net that protects people against long-term disability, chronic illness, and other kinds of health complications that emerge after a person has suffered from trauma. Time and time again, we see this pattern playing out. We patch people up, and we send them out into their communities, where they're left to fend for themselves. Now, after finishing my PhD at UCLA, I moved to the East Coast, and I took a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's Health and Society Scholars. This was housed at the University of Pennsylvania, which is located in Philadelphia. At that time, Philadelphia had the highest homicide rate amongst the top 10 largest cities in the US. And I went there with one question that animates all of my work. What happens to the people we save? And so on Friday afternoons, I would go and sit in the hospital in an empty exam room. Nurses would screen patients and ask if they wanted to talk to me. If they said yes, I would go and sit with them while they met with doctors or while they waited for x-rays and test results. I would go on to interview 40 other gunshot victims, many of whom were just like Flawless. They were young black men who got shot because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And importantly, they lacked access to long-term health care. I also spent time with 9 gunshot victims outside of the clinic in their everyday lives. And in this part of my research, I was trying to understand, how do people cope with the different injuries that they suffer in a shooting? For example, I met a guy named Marlon. Marlon had been shot in an armed robbery. The gunman shot Marlon once cleanly through his leg. The bullet entered his leg and exited the other side, shattering his femur on the way out. Marlon couldn't walk for a year. He was bedridden. And during that year, his health suffered greatly. Marlon suffered from sleep apnea. He had herniated discs in his back. He had arthritis in his hips and knees. He gained a lot of weight. He had heart problems. And he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Getting shot without access to long-term health care is the beginning of a rapid descent in a person's health. Now, at the end of the day, Flawless's story, Marlon's story, and the stories of thousands of other young people who get shot and survive highlight a modern-day healthcare paradox. On one hand, we've become better and better at saving people's lives. Over the last 50 years, doctors have developed new techniques and procedures and accumulated a wealth of knowledge, all of which has drastically reduced the risks of dying from a gunshot wound. In fact, just a few months ago, the FDA released for civilian use this thing called the XStat syringe. The XStat syringe was originally developed by first responders in combat zones. Medics figured out that soldiers were dying because they would bleed to death before they could get airlifted to safety, where they could get operated on. And so they developed a little syringe that contains a bunch of sponges that when deployed, these sponges soak up a person's blood in their gunshot wound and stop their bleeding within seconds. This is amazing. And we should celebrate this because it represents the latest technology in terms of how far we've come in saving people's lives. But at the same time, we have a healthcare system that doesn't continue caring for the people that we save. Gunshot victims like Flawless and Marlon need access to physical rehabilitative care so that they can relearn how to use their broken and wounded bodies. Gunshot victims like Flawless and Marlon need access to long-term mental health care so that they can go and talk to somebody who can help them cope with what they've been through. Gunshot victims like Flawless and Marlon need access to occupational services and assistance so that they can find jobs after they've been knocked out of the labor market due to being injured or in hospital. These kinds of care are necessary for rebuilding lives, and unfortunately, in the current system, most gunshot victims are not getting the help they need. As I alluded to earlier, we patch people up and we send them off and leave them to fend for themselves. Gunshot victims deserve a whole lot better. Now, as a sociologist, I often think about institutions and how institutions are responsible for producing patterns of inequality and suffering on the ground that we can observe in people's lives. And sometimes it can feel really daunting to think about how can we reform an entire healthcare system? How can we reform policies that are entrenched in different organizations and in government? But one of the most powerful lessons that I've learned through my experiences is about the power of empathy. This is a power that we all have. When I started this study, I was scared that people wouldn't want to talk to me, that I would ask the wrong questions, that I would add to a person's stress and amplify their suffering. But I discovered the opposite. People were eager to talk. People were eager to tell me their story. The people I met wanted someone to listen to them. Sometimes people would call me up and ask me, when are you coming back again? Because it really helped having someone to talk to. It felt like I got a big weight off my chest. Other people would introduce me to their friends and family as their shrink. I would tell them that I'm not a shrink. But time and time again, I saw the power of listening to people and of showing them empathy. Many of us in this room right now probably know someone who is suffering or who has recently been through a trauma. Maybe you know someone who's been shot. Maybe you know someone who's been raped or sexually assaulted. Maybe you know someone who's sick. Maybe you know someone who's going through a difficult transition in their lives. Whatever the case may be, we all have the power to listen to people and to show them empathy. We all have the power to allow people to tell their stories. Because when we let a person tell their story, we honor them, we validate their experiences, and we give them the space to begin healing. Thank you.